Hi, I like Pokemon, and while the creatures of the world are great, yes, my favorite part of Pokemon has always been the people, the characters. Every generation we are introduced to a new cast of characters to guide us through this new region that we have to deal with for the next 2 to 5 years, depending on what Game Freak wants to do. But my second favorite thing about Pokemon has to be the liberties taken with the formula every year. In order to keep Pokemon games timeless and refreshing, they ironically have to follow a formula so people know about what to expect. Just because the games are all formulaic doesn't mean they're all the same. That's why people have favorite Pokemon games. It does go beyond nostalgia. Some games do certain things better than others. Subjectively, of course, this is all opinion. I believe that a good form of creativity can shine when someone is first given guidelines and then is told to make something unique out of it. So even though through the formula of these games, all of these characters can be easily sorted into categories based on what their roles in the story are, they all fill these roles in very different ways. The role that's probably filled in the most diverse, different, and controversial ways is a category that I've decided to name the Big Bad. I believe the real term would be main villain or primary antagonist, but I think Big Bad is more fun. And I know it says villain on the tin, but the term Pokemon villain can be very general and apply to a bunch of characters that I'm not trying to talk about today. Before we get fully into it though, I just want to preface that 1, I am by no means a literary expert or anything of the sort. I just want to talk about blorbos from my games and why they're funny to me. Anything stated is opinion, and me sharing my opinion doesn't invalidate yours, yada yada. Please keep the discussion civil and think before you argue. 2, I haven't actually played that many Pokemon games. Listen, these are the ones that I've played to the end, and these are the ones that I'm still working through. Massive air quotes around that, as I haven't touched Let's Go Pikachu in at least 2 years. So, how am I doing this video? Well, I'm going through all of their quotes on Bulbapedia like the wiki snob I am. Sorry, but it's a lot more efficient than playing through these games or watching a bunch of walkthroughs just for these videos. And Pokemon's never really been a visual franchise anyways, at least for the past couple games. But if there is a detail or two that I am missing, then that's probably why. But what is a big bad of Pokemon? Well, before I describe the criteria for the category, let me list who all is actually in the category. The 11 characters we're going to be talking about today are Giovanni, Archie, Maxie, Cyrus, Getsis, Lysander, Lusamine, Rose, Volo, Sada, and Turo. That's it. See, there's only one per game. I hear some shouts now of people who think other characters should be on this list, such as In, or Penny, or even Guzma. I wasn't really certain of all the characters that should be on this list, and I wondered why I included some over others. It certainly wasn't that they were the final boss of their games. Only 4 of these guys could even be considered for final boss status, and they all have the special reasons for being as such. For the rest of them, it's the champions that are the final bosses instead, which is how a Pokemon game typically goes. Another criteria that I thought about was that they're all the mastermind behind it all, the one running the show, but that doesn't really work either. That idea only applies to the games where the evil team are the central antagonist. I use it to exclude In and Guzma, but it's a definition that would fit Penny greatly. It doesn't even exclude In all that well, and you could definitely argue that the definition would fit the Rocket execs. It couldn't have been a lack of redeemability either, as a good half of this list gets redeemed in one way or another. So I've decided that a Pokemon Big Bad is the single person who is bringing about a disaster. The one who, if you don't defeat, will make this world dramatically worse in some way. So it's not the strongest definition, but it's one that works. Hopefully just by looking at the characters in this category can define it enough though. So now that we have a definition, what else do we look for in a Pokemon Big Bad? Well, the first thing you need for any antagonist or villain is a reason to be against them. That's the whole purpose of an antagonist, to stand against the protagonist. This is done through 2 components of a villain. First, their goal. Whatever they hope to achieve is something that is unambiguously bad or disastrous. Since Pokemon is a video game and the protagonist is a blank slate for anyone to customize in any way they want, in both personality and character, the villain's goal needs to be something that essentially everyone can stand against. The disaster they hope to bring is either a form of mass destruction upon the region, the environment, or the world, or the disaster is the villain gaining significant power of some kind, whether it be physical or social power. Both will usually involve summoning or wielding the legendary Pokemon of the game in some way. And there's definitely overlap between causing destruction and gaining power, such as the villain gaining power to intentionally cause destruction. Cyrus, Volo, and Lysander to an extent are all in this category. There's non-intentional mass destruction too, such as the Time Professors, the Hoenn villains, Rose, and technically kind of Lusamine, but only in one interpretation. She's a whole thing, don't worry about it. And Getsis and Giovanni are examples of the villain gaining a lot of social power if they succeed, although Giovanni and sequel Getsis seek to gain social power through threats of mass destruction. I think it's interesting how most of the fear factor that Pokemon villains bring are from smarts, cunning, and social influence. No Pokemon villain is just naturally powerful, which is funny when you compare them to the Musclemen, Future Seers, and Telekinetics found in the franchise. However, none of these goals are morally gray in any way. These goals are either wanted by people who are explicitly malicious or just a little confused. When something like that happens, you can lose out on some elements of making a villain really interesting. Pure evil villains can exist and work, and Pokemon does have villains who are evil for the heck of it, but if that's all there is to the villain, or the villain doesn't have the personality or characterization to back it up, then you lose out on some extra spice or fun that a villain could be bringing to a story. So the other component for a big bad to be hated are dislikable character traits, which are displayed and highlighted through dislikable actions that the character performs, a sort of kick the puppy moment to cement more personal and interesting reasons to hate a villain. For some examples, a good half of Pokemon big bads are horrible parental figures in some way, where they usually prioritize themselves and their goal above taking care of a child. The Time Professors and Lusamine both neglect or reject their children in pursuit of their ideal worldview, which highlights their self-absorption and inability to consider others' worldviews. Even if they did have some sort of love for their children, or had goals that, according to their worldview, were intended to help their children and the world, they still prioritize chasing that ideal above raising a child. That is usually not the best thing to do according to most people, and a good reason to hate the villain. Giovanni also leaves Silver so he can hide a little better after his empire crumbles, but the unique thing about him is that this detail was not added to his character until either 3 or 13 years after he debuted, depending on which game you cite for evidence. Either way, Giovanni prioritizes gaining power over his own child, which shows how self-centered he is, and is a more compelling reason to hate the simplest of villains. There's Rose, whose relationship with Bede is not exactly father-son, and is also meant to affect Bede much more than him, but is still applicable here. Rose's general disregard of Bede, while Bede idolizes him in return, is meant to highlight Rose's tendency to not prioritize much besides the future of Galar. He didn't help Bede because he saw potential in the kid, but because he saw another young person who would help Galar prosper. This is further emphasized when Bede acts out of line and destroys a Stow on-side mural, an important piece of Galarian history, to help Rose. Rose is very quick to punish him for the act, despite admitting to seeing potential in Bede. If one can't contribute to the prosperity of the region or hinders it in any way, then they don't deserve success. It's a very patriotic perspective and not a very ideal one. Ghetsis' manipulation of Anne is the peak of his villainy, molding an ostracized child, the most malleable thing in the world, to pursue false truths or ideals for your personal gain is a pretty not okay thing to do. It's kind of messed up, so that's peak villain behavior if you ask me. Of course, Ghetsis' lies don't end at Anne. He lies to basically everyone, including those who work for him, so he's not winning sympathy points from anyone. Since he believes he can lie to anyone to gain anything he wants, it shows that Ghetsis is again very self-centered and might have a very heavy ego, and people with egos are not generally fun to be around. Other villains do this too. Cyrus disregards most people and Pokemon and is strictly lesser than him. His general disassociation from the world around him and his smarter-than-thou perspective makes him a scary threat and shows how callous he is. You can't sympathize with a person who can't sympathize himself. Lysander is just generally ruthless in his tactics to bring about his ideal world, as well as having a disconnect similar to Cyrus's that leads him to believe what he does. He rarely ever stops to consider counterclaims of his own worldview and believes he is always right. Talking to Lysander is like talking to a wall, and no one wants to talk to a wall. If you notice, these acts are usually directed towards a character or characters besides the protagonist, since the protagonist is a blank slate that just spawned into this world, and it's easier to have previously established actions happen to previously established characters. Volo, however, is unique because he betrays the player. It takes an entire game of build-up, but is incredibly worth it since betrayal is definitely one of the most effective reasons to hate a villain. It doesn't get more personal than it happening to you yourself, and anyone who's willing to betray a person cannot be trusted or liked one bit. There are two villains who I haven't mentioned yet, and they're the Hoenn villains, Archie and Maxie, and that's because I see no real reason to hate them. If you do have reason to hate them, then by all means please tell me, but aside from the artificial natural disaster they cause, they really don't do anything worth hating. They do the bare minimum to achieve their plans, and when they realize their plan is going astray, they help to right their wrongs instead of doubling down like some villains do. Archie and Maxie, in contrast to other villains, have beliefs and worldviews that are entirely selfless. They don't believe they're the chosen ones or have the largest ego known to man. They just want to better the environment or society for the benefit of those places. I see no real reason to dislike the characters of the Hoenn villains. But other than that, an evil goal and evil/dislikable character actions and traits are pretty necessary components for making an effective villain, so you need reasons to dislike and stand against them. Another thing that helps is good character design, since visual impressions are the primary way you get all your first impressions of a character. Pokemon is full of absolute bangers of character designs, and they did not slack on the villains. They aren't the most intricate, complex, or even unique designs since they did Business Suit about 3 times, but they're all definitely iconic. When it comes to Pokemon, you can usually recognize characters by outfit alone, and this definitely rings true for the villains. So, that's alright. I mean, after the sick design and a reason to stand against them, what else do you really need for a big bad? Well, Pokemon usually does pretty well on giving good reasons to stand against the villain, but actually making the characters of the villain effective is a whole nother thing. The most essential parts of a Pokemon villain all kinda go hand in hand with each other, that being motivation, characterization, and execution of the character. I guess good execution could also be interpreted as consistency. A Pokemon Big Bad typically needs a good motive to make them grounded, so they can be perceived as somewhat reasonable and rational. Yes, they may be doing unreasonable and irrational things, but there's gotta be a reason for the unreason, you know. This will take up a majority of the video, by the way, since it's by far the most interesting topic. Most Pokemon villains are supposed to come off as calculating and cunning, since most of them have extremely large followings and a lot of power and influence. They have to have a solid motive for doing the things they do, or else you're just arguing with a confusing idiot, and no one likes to do that. Now, a solid motive doesn't have to be a complex motive. It doesn't have to be the most captivating, heart-wrenching, conflicting motive that really makes you think about the true difference between right and wrong, how blurred that line really is. No, it doesn't. It just has to be understandable from their perspective and in line with their character, as well as being presented in as clear of a way as the story allows. That's it. Simple writing doesn't mean bad writing. A lot of Pokemon villains have simple motives, namely Giovanni, the first ever villain. He's about as simple as it gets. Mafia boss / crime lord is a pretty hard stereotype to mess up. Giovanni just wants to gain and preserve power and is willing to do what it takes to get that, including harnessing Mewtwo. He keeps up a good public personality to hide and aid his criminal schemes and prioritizes his empire above all. When it comes crashing down, he forces himself into hiding so he can build up his influence again and return to power one day. I do think it's interesting to note that in the original Red, Blue, Yellow games, he says he's going to dedicate his life to the studying Pokemon and then vanishes. However, in his later appearances, he makes the more well-known claim, and the one that I like more, that he will dedicate his life to training his Pokemon. I believe it fits his power-hungry character more and is more believable for him than studying Pokemon. Sure, he may want to study Pokemon to realize their true power, but he seems more like a guy that would do that through actively training his Pokemon than passively studying them. And then there's his whole monologue in those 2 Heart Gold Soul Silver events where he just outright states that he wants to rejoin and revive his team. I do think that if he was originally written in modern Pokemon, they'd probably show us more of his public-facing persona before ripping out the rug from you. You'd probably get to meet him early on, get to know who he is, and he'd tell you all except I am the main villain of this game, and yet somehow the game will still try to treat him like a twist villain and they really got you and I'm getting ahead of myself. To be honest, I don't think Lysander and Giovanni are comparable, because while in concept their setup is the same, popular businessman turns out to be the villain and is lying to us the whole time, they're also completely opposite in how their respective stories go about the reveal. We're introduced to crime guy Giovanni and thwart his schemes before we ever figure out he was supposed to be or was formerly the Viridian leader. Lysander is vice versa, where we're introduced to nice guy Lysander before bad guy Lysander is revealed. Plenty of people have already talked about how obvious the Lysander reveal was, so when we get to Lysander, we'll talk about something else. But sticking with Giovanni, he's definitely the simplest villains, but also the least compelling. Giovanni is evil for the sake of being so, because evil people just exist sometimes, so that they can use him in any scenario as a secret almighty head honcho because that's who he is, a power-hungry, egotistical, criminal mastermind, and nothing more. Another extremely well done villain, probably the most solid villain out of them all, is Ghetsis. Just like Giovanni, Ghetsis is egotistical, and just like Giovanni, Ghetsis wants power, more specifically to rule over all of Unova. Also like Giovanni, he doesn't care what he has to do to gain that power. Now Ghetsis is different from the rest of the villains because his entire arc spans 2 games. All of the other villains on this list only appear and do their thing in one setting, even if it has multiple iterations. Or their Team Rocket, who is also the villain of 2 or 3 stories, but are wildly different in all of those games. Ghetsis has the same goal in both games. What I find interesting is how radically different he goes about achieving his goal in both games. At first he tries the lying method, the trickery method if you'd like, where he tries to gain people's trust and compliance through deception. The lie in question being that Team Plasma just wants to separate people from Pokemon and to improve the world, as it'd be better for all parties involved. When he tells us to regular people, he pressures them by phrasing it like it's a good thing, by using the word liberate and telling people to think of the well-being of the Pokemon. Aren't they suffering in your care? But when confronted by actual authority who could easily counter his point, he specifically rephrased their cause to be separating Pokemon from foolish and wicked people. What he doesn't say is that he thinks foolish and wicked people are all people. All people except him, of course, because he's perfect. As far as Ghetsis is concerned, anything is okay to do as long as he benefits, like lying, which is a pretty bad thing and might cause people to look badly at him in the long run. But it won't matter in the long run because by then he'll have obtained all the power he wants. But his dream of total power gets crushed once the player does their thing, and N decides it's not worth it to fight anymore because the only thing that mattered to him was the ideal that Getsus was preaching, which to Getsus was a lie. So the next time that Getsus appears, he ditches the lie. People already know he's a fake anyways. If he can't take the people by deception, he'll take them by force, and resolve to freeze the city. This complete turnaround of Getsus' methods splits Team Plasma between those who followed N and just wanted to save Pokemon, and those who followed Getsus to be on the man's side when he gets in charge. And then the player crushes him again, and he has a mental breakdown, yells at N, and is never seen again. We're told later that he can't do anything anymore because he's lost his heart. And of course he would have a breakdown after failing. A guy like Getsus probably can't cope with the idea that he's failed not once, but twice. And that's the thing, Getsus has a full arc of his downfall that spans 2 games, and I think it's fascinating, because it really does more for his character. Getsus would have been a great one-time villain, but he becomes more effective as a character throughout his presence in 2 games. Getsus wants power because he believes he is perfect, that he is the ideal leader. Despite him always allocating the public leadership of Team Plasma to someone else, first N and then Colress, he's always scheming in the background. He always refers to Team Plasma as his, he always refers to the dream as his. Getsus only cares about what he gets and how he benefits from all of it. The only thing he cares about when it comes to other people is how he can use them and how they could take the blame for everything should it all come crashing down. And I think having an ego like that is key for a character like Getsus, is having the motivation of power. Because wanting power is not a bad motivation. It's one of the simplest motivations out there, but it's definitely not a bad motivation. Who doesn't want power and authority for everyone to listen to every word of yours? The character just has to fit the motive of wanting power, because a kind, caring person who looks out for others is not the type of person you give the motive of power to. Maybe you could give those characters motives of wanting to improve the world or finding an absolute way to protect everyone, and maybe those motives could involve obtaining power, but it's not wanting power at its core. It's gotta be someone who's self-centered, who has a motive of obtaining more and more power, or else the character will come off as a little weird. Getsus and Giovanni are perfect examples of this, as self-centered people who only gather people around them as means for obtaining and preserving power. Another character similar to these two is Cyrus. Cyrus, or more specifically Platinum Cyrus, only sees the people and objects around him as tools to further his plans. He doesn't say he uses them as tools, but he definitely doesn't see them as people. He gets people to follow him through convincing speeches, commanding personality, and lies. However, as a contrast to Getsus and Giovanni, Cyrus doesn't want power just for the sake of having power. Cyrus wants power in order to shape the world to his image and create a world without emotion or strife. It's, again, a very simple characterization that comes from having an ego, but not a bad one. At least in Platinum. It's worth mentioning that Diamond and Pearl are infamous for being lackluster compared to their third versions, and that extends to their story. Cyrus' speech and the conversation that the player has with him in the Team Galactic HQ, as well as his grandfather, some lines from the Team Galactic commanders, and the entire Distortion world are only present in Platinum, which sucks because they're all either important or helpful parts of Cyrus' character. He's still definitely an admirable threat in Diamond and Pearl, but he becomes a lot more effective and compelling in Platinum. We're actually able to hear the convincing speeches that Cyrus makes that gets so many people to follow him, despite him being very off-putting as far as we have seen from him. He tells us in secret that he doesn't care about benefiting Team Galactic, is lying to them, and only claims to make a world for himself. He spends the whole game shunning and scolding people for having emotions and caring for others. When he finally gets his comeuppance in the Distortion world, in Platinum, he has his breakdown and has emotions while he does it. He then curses himself for having emotions and runs off to become better. I will admit that in Diamond and Pearl, he does get a lot more aggressive and emotional than he is in the rest of the game, upon both his success and defeat, but he never explicitly states that he's feeling emotions and dislikes that. Instead, he just gets philosophical and asks the player about perfection. Both Platinum and DP Cyrus are good villains, and are very close to being the same character, but Platinum Cyrus just has more effective details to him, and thus a more compelling arc. This happens a lot with villains that have 2 separate appearances. Lusamine, Archie, and Maxie appear in 2 different stories where they are changed pretty dramatically as characters. Before we get into that though, let's talk about the last pretty solid villain, who is also our last entirely selfish villain, Volo. This probably won't be very long though. Volo's great, but there's not too much to say about him without sounding like a broken record, and I haven't beat Legends Arceus. Volo, like the rest, lies to people to get what he wants. Unlike all the villains we've talked about previously though, Volo is distinctly a twist villain. Throughout the whole game, he's playing a long con before revealing his plan to rewrite the cosmos to make a better, fairer world. What makes him unique is that, due to the gameplay of Legends Arceus, Volo spends a lot more time with the player than the rest of the villains. He's genuinely helpful to the player throughout their travels that you hardly consider him as a villain until he starts dropping hints and eventually rips the rug out from under you. or unless you know Latin, in which case his name alone is a pretty good indicator. I accidentally spoiled this twist to my friend before I had even touched the game myself by pointing this out. Volo's pretty solid though. He only appears in one story, so he only has one interpretation and can't fall victim to that thing where two versions of the game are based on contradictory things, and thus the villain is completely reasonable in one interpretation and not so reasonable in the other. We'll come back to this concept later. Volo's closer relationship with the player makes him a lot more unique compared to other villains. He has no real organization or any kind of backing or notoriety behind him, it's just him and his studies, which makes him a different kind of threat than the head honchos we've been accustomed to so far in the series. Plus, he has a selfish motivation, which is a much easier villain to write than a selfless one. One thing I do want to point out about Volo though, and I'm recording this in post, is that while the concept and execution of his betrayal are great, the setup is a little shaky. His sentences where he talks about how he found things unfair when he was younger seems a little tacked on and honestly kind of unnecessary. I think just making Volo someone who is extremely dedicated to becoming equals with gods would have been fine. If he spent his entire life studying their tales, I can see him becoming obsessed with obtaining power just for his sake. Hubris is the fatal flaw of humans and heroes, and it's completely plausible for arrogant Volo to succumb to it. I think the writers thought that the stakes wouldn't be high enough if that was the case though, so they added on the possibility of the world being destroyed to heighten tensions. You'll notice that up until now, I've only discussed selfish villains, and that's because most of Pokemon's big bads with more selfish motivations are pretty well written. The trickier ones are the selfless villains, because it's easy to write a selfish villain, it's easy to hate and want to take down a selfish person. But a selfless person? It's hard to disagree with someone who wants to improve the world. And yes, you might be thinking something like, well, Lysandra and Rose were pretty selfish, and didn't you say earlier that most villains acted in a self-centered or self-absorbed way? Yes, their actions may be selfish, but their motives aren't. Cyrus, Giovanni, Getsus, and Volo are pretty clear on the fact that everything they are doing is for them. The rest of these villains usually make the claim that their actions will be beneficial for something greater than themselves. So when you have a selfless villain, usually the villain is trying to improve the world through a disastrous method that will do more harm than good to get you to stand against them. The most interesting selfless villain has to be Lucamine, because she doesn't really seek to improve the world out of a genuine thought that she's right, but out of insanity. She's also an interesting case of character preservation throughout multiple iterations of a story. Remember, I mentioned that before we talked about Volo, so it's not the worst segue ever. Pokemon has made some questionable choices when making and releasing games. For example, third versions. I get that it was supposed to be an updated version of the game before they could really do wireless updates. It's probably why they don't do third versions anymore, despite some people wishing that they would. However, the weirdest release decision, at least talking about mainline games, has to be the Ultra games. Don't get me wrong, I love Alola, I will defend Alola until the day I die, but I will also be the first to criticize it. Why did they make the Ultra games? Because the Ultra games are not remakes. They were made in the same generation, on the same hardware, and the changes made in that game are not remake worthy. And some people like to say they're like third versions or the regular games but with DLC. However, the story and the content of the game is changed too dramatically to justify that it's only upgraded or expanded upon in any way. Content is both added and removed to both benefit and harm the story and gameplay of the Alola games. Whether or not you like one set of games better than the other just depends on what you prefer in a story or game. One of the most important changes they made was the introduction of Necrozma and elaborating on the Ultra storyline. Instead of adding the new Ultra plotline in as something extra, they weaved it into the story, which affected major parts of it, including the characters and our villain. Lucamine's biggest change was the role she played in the story, because while she may have had a role in the disaster, she's not the main problem. At least in the Ultra games. In the original games, she was kind of the main problem. Team Skull was also an issue, but they were working for Lucamine. Necrozma is really the true big bad of the Ultra games. It poses the largest threat and has agency in the disaster since it is the disaster, but it's not as fun to talk about an animal villain as it is a human villain, so we're gonna talk about Lucamine. Lucamine's purpose in the narrative from game to game goes from being a more traditional villain with a destructive goal to mostly a device to free Necrozma. In the original Alola games, Lucamine wants everything to fit into her ideal worldview, no matter how destructive it may be for all things involved. Because Lucamine's ideal world, the stuff she calls beautiful, is not traditional beauty. I think Lucamine's worldview can best be compared to the millennial beige aesthetic, horrendously monotonous, controlling, and, again, very destructive for everyone involved. She advocates for this view under the guise of being helpful and charitable and only wanting to protect the Pokemon, as the Aether Foundation has a reputation for these things. But she's not intentionally lying or being deceptive about the guise. She does claim many times that she believes all the things she does, however horrible, are for the protection of Alola and its Pokemon. So her actions may be selfish, and from an outside perspective, so are her motives, but they aren't selfish to her. We're told that she actually used to be nice and charitable, but then she fell into a spiral of obsession with the Ultra Beast and valuing this false beauty. It's implied that this spiral came from the loss of Mon, Lucamine's husband, as Gladion speculates, but I don't think Lucamine herself or Lily ever addresses this. This plot point can also very much be ignored in the game since it's only brought up post-game. This obsession with beauty and perfection leads her to do things that are objectively bad for most people, like rejecting her children, which leads to both of them running away, releasing the Ultra Beasts and letting them run wild across Alola, and keeping frozen Pokemon in display cases. Her rejecting her children is actually very interesting because it makes the conflict between our group of protagonists and our big bad one of the most personal in the series. I said something like this earlier, but I was very general with it. The conflict with Lucamine really outshines the rest of the parent-child conflict since Lucamine is much more engaged in the story than the others, and we get to see how she treats them firsthand, whereas with Giovanni and the Time Professors, we only get to hear anecdotes about what they did. Ghetsis is also like Lucamine, but Ghetsis is also a great villain, so yeah. Anyways, her obsession with the Ultra Beast and beauty all culminates when she merges with Nihilego in Ultra Space. She gets her redemption when you free her from Nihilego, and that's the moment she calls Lily beautiful. Not because Lily has changed, but because her worldview has changed. Or at least that's how I interpret it. And it's wholesome, and Lucamine gets redeemed and is learning how to be better, and at the end of the game, she goes off to Kanto to get help for the fusing situation and steps down as president of the Aether Foundation. In the Ultra games, they have to change a lot to fit the new additions to the plot, but they are able to preserve Lucamine's character pretty well through the changes. Now her desire to protect Pokemon is directed towards Necrozma, who she sees as a threat to Alola and its inhabitants, and she decides to go after Necrozma herself and defeat or capture it depending on what game you're playing. I have no clue why they wrote this difference. Either way, it becomes her fault that Necrozma is released upon Alola, and at that point big villain status is shifted onto Necrozma for the rest of the game. Lucamine's failure to properly deal with Necrozma is what humbles her, and it makes her realize her wrongdoings. I think the Rainbow Rocket episode might also have something to do with the redemption. Either way, in this iteration, she maintains her position as Aether President post-game and resolves to be a better parent and to protect the people without trying to force them into perfection and beauty. Now, both stories have their pros and cons. In the Ultra games, we get to see Lucamine resolve to become a better person, and we get to see her little reunion with Mon. While in the regular games, we don't really get to see her try to correct her ways as much. However, I like Lucamine more in the regular games because the events leading up to Lucamine becoming humbled are more impactful and work better in my opinion. I don't see Lucamine fighting Necrozma as an irrational feeling that could only come from her being so self-absorbed. Lucamine is a very capable trainer as far as we know, since she's able to challenge you as champion in the post-game, and I assume she has plenty of resources should anything go wrong with Necrozma, or just as backup to help deal with Necrozma, since she is the Aether President and probably has access to many such resources. Meanwhile, her merging with Nihilego is much more impactful as a changing moment. It's the peak of her insanity and her ideal form of beauty, but is also implied to be very damaging to her. When she's defeated by her daughter and the player, it's physical proof to her that her obsession with beauty and perfection cannot be everything. It just hits harder for me and I like it more. You can like either story though, they're both pretty good. But Lucamine is a good example of how character changes between different versions of games. The most important thing to do, if or when this happens, is to write a motive and characterization that can maintain itself between stories despite contrasting themes. Lucamine's desire for perfection is completely separate from the whole celestial theming of the Alola games. Cyrus's hate for emotion is separate from the space and time stuff of the Diamond Pearl games. Giovanni's crime empire has nothing to do with colors. As a contrast, there's In, who is not a main villain but does apply to this. Truth and ideals is a core theme of the Unova games. Depending on which game you play, In will either advocate for the pursuit of ideals or showing everyone the truth. Personally, I think it makes more sense for him to be with ideals, since he believes in pursuing the ideal world of the Pokemon living free, and you have to teach him the truth that Pokemon and people can work together. In the other game, he's attempting to convince people of the truth of the freedom of Pokemon. It doesn't make as much sense, but they don't really dwell on it that much in In's dialogue, so he gets a pass. And then there's Lysander. Now, Lysander's core desire is separate from the life and death theming of the Kalos games. His frustrations with the imperfections of the world is his motivation for the goals he tries to achieve, and leads to him becoming a misanthrope. Thank you, Bulbapedia, for teaching me that word. He fears for the day that the world become imperfect and ugly through overpopulation and the inherent greed found in humanity, so Lysander resolves to put a stop to it. And so you think, okay, Lysander's going to try and put this world in a stasis state using whichever box art legendary he has to preserve the world and prevent it from changing by stopping any more people from leaving the world and or stopping any more people from entering the world. Maybe he'll also spend the game glorifying whichever legendary he's going to use and what they represent. But then he'll realize that doing that will do more harm than good and that the cycles of life and death are one and the same. Maybe he'll learn about the delicate balance between the two. And then he'll find out about the true beauty of the world is embracing the world with both its imperfections and perfections, and the theme of the game is accepting change or something or other. Or he could double down on his belief and die at the end like he actually does in the game. But no, Lysander does not do that. In order to prevent the world from becoming imperfect and ugly, he will reduce the population by killing all those not within Team Flare and killing all Pokemon. I know the Pokemon Life is going to do that with the way you've set it up, but okay. Or well, that whole thing is Lysander's initial goal. Once you defeat him a couple times, he has his breakdown and listen, I believe this joke went around quite a bit ago, but the sheer difference of what Lysander does after his breakdown between both games is so hilarious that I cannot tell it to you straight, and I'm just going to quote his Bulbapedia article. After being defeated for the third and final time, Lysander expresses his disgust towards the fact that his beautiful world will never become a reality. The player and their friends attempt to reason with him, saying that if people cooperate together, a better world is possible. Lysander, however, rejects the idea as mere naivete, and then either attempts to force immortality on the player, their friends, and himself in Pokemon X, or, in Pokemon Y, kill everyone in the building, and fires the ultimate weapon using what little power still remains. What? We're supposed to see Lysander as somewhat reasonable and logical, right? He's a tech guy, he's a businessman, he's a man of science. These decisions don't feel like a logical leap for a guy like Lysander to make. Backed into a corner with a weapon that can do basically whatever he wants, and he chooses to be petty? I can believe he would be emotional when he's at his wit's end, since he's very passionate about what he believes in, but he'd probably direct that rage at a final attempt to bring about his vision instead of trying to kill these children in particular, or at least have a little more provocation before doing so. Speaking of which, kill everyone in the building or bestow immortality upon all those in the room, those two decisions should not be made by the same person. Wasn't his whole goal to kill everyone but Team Flare? Only Team Flare is in the building. To be fair, Lysander doesn't say he's gonna kill everyone in the building, so he could be planning to do something else, but I think they phrase it the way they do because they can't say the words "I'm going to kill you" in a Pokemon game. And the immortality thing? Again, it's an act of pettiness that I don't believe he would try. So what if those in the room gain immortality? Lysander would just go to jail immediately afterwards and then rot in his cell for literal eternity since he can't die, and the player is now on good terms with the gods of life and death, so I'm sure they can get their mortality thing sorted out if they really wanted to. Either way, they're both insane conclusions to come to and are still so wildly different that I have such a hard time believing that the same guy in the same circumstance could come to both of them. Yes, the ultimate weapon is powered by two different beings with life and death respectively in each game, so Lysander's final decision could be influenced by that, but it's just such a wild juxtaposition that it really makes you do a double take just to make sure that it's the same guy. And when you have that issue, you can do one of several things. You can avoid it by making the villain's motives and goals completely alien to the theming of the games. You can work with it by twisting their words and actions around in such a way where the motives and goals do remain constant, but still carry the themes of either game in them. Or if it's really that hard to work with, just give up completely and make them two different people. Then you don't have to worry about variance in a character's interpretation because it's literally two different characters. That's what they did in the Hoenn games, and it worked wonders. Instead of worrying about how they were possibly going to translate the land versus earth debate and maintain character integrity and aesthetics between the two, they just didn't, and now we have not one but two great and memorable Pokemon antagonists. Actually, in the Gen 3 Hoenn games, they do kind of suffer from this problem. Archie and Maxie were essentially copy and pasted from each other and were not very distinct from each other aside from design and type preferences. Even their dialogue was essentially the same to the point of getting some things factually wrong, like Maxie forgetting that fish exist. I guess they technically exist on land, but it's land that's like very far beneath them. Or the writers clearly realizing that Team Aqua would have no actual use for Mount Chimneys, but they kind of made something up that doesn't make too much sense if you think about it. So what if the crater floods? It's still at the top of a mountain. There's gotta be other better places to let sea life thrive. However, it was simpler times, so I do think they get a pass back then. But in Gen 6, since they aren't trying to maintain one character across contrasting themes, we just have two great characters that act independently of each other. Yes, they are trying to achieve somewhat similar things, but they are different things and thus are given entirely different motives. Archie is an environmentalist who wants Pokemon to thrive and dislikes humans' treatment of the sea, and Maxie is an industrialist, I guess I know a better word, who believes in the progress of society and wants more land for humans to develop. Their dialogue is also enhanced to be more distinct from each other and let their individual personalities shine. My favorite example has to be what they say to each other in the seafloor cavern when they're mocking the other one for failure. It shows that Archie is more sarcastic and joking, whereas Maxie is more cutthroat and blunt. So you would think, okay, Pokemon now knows the benefit of just having two different characters when the themes conflict too much, and they also know how to use that to their advantage to make some great characters. So tell me why they immediately fell back into making version-specific villains copy-pasted from each other. In Gen 9, we got our first version-specific villains since the Hoenn games. Our Polly and Big Bads are Professors Sada and Turo, and they are the exact same as each other. I actually think they're more similar than Gen 3 Maxie and Archie. Seriously, pull up both of their quotes articles in 2 separate tabs and just click between them because it's wild. The only words that change are like Karaidon, Maridon, Past Future, Sada, Turo, and other words like that. It's insane to me that they were able to successfully update It's insane to me that they were able to successfully update Archie and Maxie to be fan favorites, and then they immediately fell back into making the same mistakes that made them somewhat forgettable to begin with. It's even worse actually, because at least Gen 3 Maxie and Archie still existed in the plot either way, giving more necessity to them being separate people, but neither professor exists in the other's world as far as we know. Yes, there's the one journal entry, but no one is mentioned by name, so that could really be anyone. So what was even the point of making them 2 different people? Aside from aesthetic switch up, they are literally the same person. All of their key characteristics they both have, so why did they bother with making them 2 separate people? If the aesthetic switch up was really so important to them, they could just do that. Have one character, but have them wear a different outfit and say a couple things differently in either game. You can do something like that, Pokemon. It's okay. And the Time Professor's major difference, where one likes the past and the other prefers the future, isn't even elaborated upon properly enough to warrant there being a difference. It's not like Sada's a more sentimental person while Turo is more innovative like Oris, Archie, and Maxie were. They just both think that bringing the creatures of a different time period would bring about their paradise for reasons that we never really get to know. We're told what the professors are trying to accomplish, it's paradise. We're told why it's going to be disastrous if the professor succeeds, it's going to ruin the ecosystem, but we're never told the professor's reasoning as to why they believe this paradise will still be great for everyone despite the obvious disruption and disaster it will cause. And you want to know why we never get to know their reasons? Because the actual professors are dead before the story even starts. And you know what? Touche, Pokemon. Since they couldn't properly write out or explain their villain's motivation, they just killed them off so they never have to explain it in the first place. Hurrah, Pokemon, you've solved writing. What do we even get from the professors dying that we couldn't get from them living? Since the professors die, we get the AI plot twist, which is a one-time shock value twist that really only explains why their dialogue was so stilted, which I hardly noticed, or the speech malfunction, which only happened about 15 minutes beforehand. If the professor had maybe done more of that over the course of the game, it would have been a slightly more effective plot twist, but it has so little build-up that it doesn't really matter. The AI plot twist also doesn't really explain why the professor never left the crater. You would think, oh no, the professor never left the crater because the professor died years ago and no one ever found out, womp womp, that sucks for Arven. And it would be kind of heartfelt and somber because we know the professor didn't intentionally neglect their child and was probably a good person. But no, looking at the timeline of the game, the original professor must have died mere days before the game begins, if not hours. I could be getting my facts mixed up, but the write-on of whatever game you have loses a territorial dispute that destroys the 4th research station and causes it to leave the crater, and that happens at the beginning of the game. Supposedly that same territory dispute is the one that kills the professor, so that's also muffled by the AI twist. If the professor had lived, we could have gotten a sweet little reconciliation between them and Arven. Perhaps once you defeat them, they do a little self-reflection and realize that maybe you shouldn't abandon your child in pursuit of ideal worlds. Instead of always dwelling in the past or constantly thinking about the future, you should try to focus on the present. But no, instead we get this half-hearted line from the AI that's like, I'm sorry I impersonated your dead parent and gave you hope that they may want to be in your life, but trust me, they loved you a lot. I would know more than anyone. Anyways, I'm gonna leave and never return now, despite being the closest thing you have to a parent. The only reason I could think of them having the AIs exist at all is to explain the horrible battle animations they have. It sucks and it's stupid because I don't want to hate the professors. The potential is there. The potential to be some of the most compelling pokevillains is absolute within the Time Professor's characters, both on their own and as joint characters. But Pokemon just couldn't find that potential within the time restraints that they had to write and develop the games. So they just kind of put a nail in the coffin that is the Paldea games with another set of weak villains with contrived motivations and shaky characterization. Speaking of contrived motivations, I only really have one more villain to talk about, so let's rip into Rose, shall we? After the Alola game's success of being a refreshing change of pace to the Pokemon formula, Game Freak decided to just do what Alola did again. That included doing the twist villain plot again, where the evil team of the game is just a group of hooligans, and the actual threat is a corporation, and the real villain is the legendary they released. But when copying Alola, they didn't do it as well as Alola. Say what you want about Team Yell, we're not talking about them. Rose though, oh buddy. Rose aims to bring about an event called the Darkest Day, which is also Eternatus, the Pokemon of Power, to provide limitless energy for the Galar region. And so you're thinking, okay, the Galar region is low on energy and is about to run out. Maybe that's another reason why Spikemuth is so dark. Not only does it not have a power spot, but it just doesn't get as much of the energy as the rest of Galar for conservation reasons. But no, the Galar region is okay for the next millennium, according to Rose himself. Do you know how long a millennium is? Electricity was only first harnessed about 2.5 centuries ago. A millennium ago, we were still using fire to light places and animals to drive vehicles. Paper printed money was invented, and the canon of medicine was published a millennia ago. Do you know how much we have progressed since then? And Rose calls the situation an energy crisis. Dude, in the real world, technology progresses exponentially. I cannot imagine how it is in the Pokemon world, where they had easy teleportation over a decade ago. In a century max, they'll probably figure out better, safer ways to generate power that don't involve waking up demons. Maybe if Rose was portrayed as more selfish and looking out for how he himself will be remembered in the decades or centuries to come, like how leaders do whatever they can to make their mark in history during their short-term limits before they're out of power, then it would make more sense as to why Rose would try something so disastrous, but he's constantly characterized as a guy who cares about the people. It's not a facade he puts up to gain power. Even when he's away from the public eye, he's still preaching about securing Galar's future. It's a genuine care that we're told he has. It's possible that he may just be really paranoid about Galar's future and thinks Galar will never get another leader who cares about this again. He has this one line where he calls it his duty, purpose, and destiny to fix this so-called energy crisis that Galar has. But like, you didn't consider windmills before considering awakening a living nuclear reactor? Galar has plenty of open plains. You could fit some solar panels in there. I don't know, maybe he's trying to avoid infrastructure costs. Renewable energy might cost a healthy amount of money, but awakening demons is free. It's just horrible execution when you think about it for longer than a second. Contrived motivations and horrible execution that makes Rose the weakest Pokemon villain in my eyes. But hey, you might see him differently. You might see them all differently than I do. Maybe you think Rose is portrayed as obsessed with his mark on history and I'm reading it wrong. Maybe you think Lysander would be petty in his final moments and both decisions that he made are logical for him. Maybe you think Getsus is an awful villain and his crybaby attitude makes him unintimidating. Maybe you think Sada and Turo are well executed and they are the greatest Pokemon villains and I am being too nitpicky. But that's the fun of literature and storytelling. It's all subjective at the end of the day, so can we keep it chill in the comments? As a treat, this is my personal ranking of Pokemon villains. It is slightly influenced by everything we just discussed, but it is all just based on personal preference. If I could include Guzma on this list, he would be at the top. And this is my ranking based on all the stuff we just talked about, plot effectiveness and what have you, the more objectively judgeable stuff. Pokevillains are fun. They can really make or break a Pokemon game, or at least offer a reflection of the game as a whole. For instance, Giovanni is a simple, straightforward villain, and the Kanto games are simple, straightforward plots. The Sinnoh games are pretty cohesive plots with just the right amount of ambition and pomp to one-up its predecessors, and that's what Cyrus is. And Lysander is either one of the greatest or messiest Pokemon villains of them all, same as the Kalos games. But despite this, you can't just do a story without an antagonist. A Pokemon game without a villain is just a story of a kid doing what most other kids in this world do, just with a little special treatment. The villain of the game adds a sense of grandeur to the adventure and really makes the story something worth playing. This kind of thing applies to most stories. A villain creates conflict, conflict creates plot, and plot creates story. So if you think about it, a Pokemon story is really only as effective as its villain. Let's hope ZA's villain can learn from the rest and be something fun. So those are my opinions on the big bads of Pokemon. I'd love to do this for other genres of Pokemon characters too, like rivals and champions and secondary villains, but the primary antagonist what I had the most ironed out opinions on, so that's why they were first. And I have other video ideas too, so do stick around for those if you like. I don't just do Pokemon here, I'm going to try to do all kinds of stuff. But other than that, thank you for sticking till the end, and I hope that you have a nice day.